Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Grace Christian Family Center in Tomball, Texas. I'm Danny Carpenter. Thank you for coming to Midweek Bible Study. And tonight's topic is 5 conflicts of marriage. I don't want to get anybody in trouble, but already some married man here in the assembly has asked if there are only 5. And I'm pretty sure when he asked that, he was like incredulous. There has to be more than 5. And the response that we had was if we tried to tackle all of them, we'd be here for a week. So we're just going to start with 5. The better version of that story is genuinely, I think that we can say almost every conflict we have, and there are many conflicts in marriage, almost every conflict we have can be categorized into one of these 5 categories that we're going to deal with tonight. So let's just talk for a few minutes about marriage. Marriage is that wonderful, blissful state in which we find the love of our life and we never ever have a conflict thereafter. And you know there's a collective not after that. Marriage is conflict. You put 2 people together in a commitment, a vow, till death do us part, for better or for worse, for richer or poorer, and then think that those 2 individuals, those 2 uniquely made and uniquely formed individuals will never have a clash of opinion, will never have a difference of ideas, will never want to resolve a conflict differently than the other will. That's simply unthinkable and impossible. Maturity in love brings us an awareness of the opinions of others. The older we get, maybe that's not a fair way to say it because I know some really old, cranky people. So maybe we should just say the wiser we get. Part of wisdom and growth and maturity involves the ability to simply see life from somebody else's point of view besides mine. And in every relationship, that's important, whether you're an employer or an employee, whatever your role in life is. If you never learn to see problems from another person's point of view, you won't have many friends in life and you won't resolve many issues, many conflicts. So the wiser and the more mature we become, the more we're capable of literally seeing a problem through someone else's eyes, trying to walk in their shoes a little bit, trying to wrap our head around why they see this differently than I do. It's a mark of maturity. I put in parentheses on your screen, and love. And the reason that I did that is because I don't know that the Bible uses the word maturity much. I do know it uses the word wisdom and gives us many descriptions of wisdom and holds wisdom up, personifies wisdom as a person worthy of pursuing. But I also know that it defines love with the characteristics that we often assign to maturity. Love, maturity, does not insist on getting its own way. Love does not insult the opposition. Somebody's against you. Love says, well, why are they against this? Why don't they agree? Love doesn't just insult and mock and smear, which is what we see plenty of on Facebook and other social media these days. Love does not arrogantly claim its superiority over others. Love doesn't sulk when it doesn't get its way. And of course, the verses that we're referring to are in 1 Corinthians, the 13th chapter, verse 4, starting with verse 4, where love is defined with these excellent phrases. Love suffers long, means love is very patient and endures a lot of things that aren't ideal. If you read these passages in conjunction with marriage, then you already have a sense of maturity about the relationship between you and your spouse. Love has to be patient for a marriage to work. Suffers long. I like the word suffer here. I know what it means in the King James. I know that it only means it's patient, but somehow I just like the word suffer. It seems to go hand in hand with marriage. Love suffers long. I can't stop smiling when I read that, and I need to move on. Love is kind. Love does not envy. It's not jealous. It doesn't vaunt itself, not puffed up, not arrogant above others. Love does not behave itself unseemly. Love doesn't seek its own will, its own way. Love is not easily provoked. Love thinks no evil. Retaliation is not in the vocabulary of love. Love does not rejoice in someone else's falling, someone else's sin, someone else's failure. Love never says they got what they deserved, in other words. But instead, love rejoices in the truth. Love bears every curse, every sin, every trial, every sickness. Love bears all things. Love believes all things. Love hopes all things. And love endures all things. If there was ever a perfect definition of love, that's probably it. And the married couple who has learned to let love unfold in those characteristics will certainly need very little of any lesson that I could present tonight. If I taught everything I knew about marriage success, this would be a 10-minute lesson. But I'm talking about marriage conflicts. And so I'm a master at that. I could talk for a long, long time about conflicts in marriage. I'm going to lay a little bit of groundwork past that love definition, and I'm going to say that conflicts in marriage, it helps if we identify the conflict, and that's why we're going to call or name 5 different categories in which conflicts in our relationships with others, marriage in particular is what we're talking about tonight, but these rules will apply to others, every relationship you might have. But if we identify a conflict, if we give a name to what argument, what decision we're trying to make, it does have a tendency to transform our debate in that argument. And so, for lack of any other better way to describe it, I have long used what I call the 2I rules, that every couple, every marriage, everyone in relationship ought to observe these 2 I's, and that will keep them from fighting each other. An unrelated verse in the Bible says, we don't wrestle against flesh and blood, but against powers and principalities. And even though it has nothing to do with marriage in that context, if we use that phrase, we're not supposed to fight against humanity. And that means my wife, my husband. We're not supposed to fight against people, but we always have a spiritual battle of some kind going on. And so I mentioned these 2 up at the front of this before we get to the 5 categories, simply to say, if I give my conflict, my argument, a definition, if I give it a name, then I'm able to better observe these 2 rules. And the 2 rules are simply stick to the issue, that's the first I, and then don't insult the second I. Most of the time when we get into an argument with a spouse, we are trying to win the argument. And if we're trying to win the argument, we're in a power struggle. And if we're in a power struggle, then we're not going to do anything but fight to win. And if we finally win in marriage, if you finally put your spouse in his place or her place because you win it, you have actually lost. He who thinks he wins the marital argument may be the biggest loser of all. He may have won, and in that moment he may be proud that his way ruled out, but he cannot see how dark and evil the heart of the woman can be. Or man, I don't mean this as a sexist thing. I mean of the person you defeat. When you defeat a person in marriage so that you can win, somewhere beneath that flesh may lie a monster. And they may simply be calculating their next move for the next argument. One of the best ways to avoid that is to redefine an argument. An argument is not a power struggle. It is not my opportunity to win and prove my point. An argument is simply the vehicle in which you both get to air your points of view. If you can enter that kind of an agreement in your mind and with your spouse, and understand that arguing is not supposed to just be fussing to win. Arguing is just the way that I get to hear his point of view or her point of view, and I get to air mine, and then nothing happens. We don't have to resolve it. If we have to resolve it, remember, it's a fight. It's a fight to the finish. It's a fight to win the argument. So the wise husband and the wise wife enters an argument with a redefinition of the argument being, this is my opportunity, my spouse's opportunity to lay his or her opinion on the table. Here's my opinion, here's their opinion. We get to hear both of them, think them out, and the last thing we want to do is say, now let's see which one of us wins. They do not have to be resolved. The wise spouse simply says, I'm glad we had this talk. I'm glad I got to see your point of view. Let's just, Robert's Rules of Order. Robert's Rules of Order has a procedure called tabling. After an argument has been debated on the floor, any member can say, Mr. Chairman, I move that we table this until our next meeting. And all it takes is somebody to say, I second, and that's it. It means there'll be no more discussion on this topic, but next week when we meet and reconvene, then we'll bring it up again. Now that you've heard both sides of it, we'll bring it up and talk about it again next week. Couples who can do that actually prevent themselves from getting into power struggles and the must win and I've got to be right. And to just be able to table an argument and say, I'm glad I heard your point of view. I hope you kind of understand mine. Let's think about it for a few days. Maybe we can talk about it next Saturday. And a wonderful dynamic happens to the couple that's mature enough to do that, and that is that by the time Saturday finally comes along, usually the male has understood her point of view and has realized the only way he'll ever get anything he wants is to just go along with her. But he can't just come back and say, you're right. So by the time Saturday comes and you bring it back up, he says, you know, I've been thinking about what you said, and I think we ought to do, and then he just says exactly what she said they ought to do in the first place, but it's his idea now. And then a wise wife says, I agree, that's what we ought to do, and then they just go happily into ever after. I should quit right here. I feel like a success already. You can just go make your marriage better if you just compromise and capitulate, but always let it be your spouse's point of view. I don't know. Let's backtrack and go back to this. Let me go back to the other screen. Remember, when you're in an argument, the argument is to simply hear both sides. If you do that and you can give the argument a definition, then you can keep from making it about the person. It's not about her or him because they're so stupid. It's about the issue. So keep these two rules always, ever in your mind, and stick to the issue and don't insult. The minute you insult, it becomes personal, and you say something like, how can you be so stupid? How can you be so dumb? The minute you do that, you have taken that discussion completely off of the issue. Now it's going to be about the character of the person that you just assaulted. And so the best way to never settle anything is to violate the 2I rules. Forget the issue, insult the character of that person you're married to, and then you'll never get back to the issue. You're going to have to resolve a lot of personality and character assassination things first. So remember, redefine an argument. It's not a power struggle to win. It is an opportunity for both people to air why they have a different opinion and what they think ought to happen, and then do nothing. We'll talk about it a few days later. When we do talk about it, we'll go back to this, and remember, just stick with that issue and don't insult my spouse. So that being said, let's give the issues names. These are the 5 categories that we can pretty much lump almost all of our conflicts into. And in no order of importance. There's just 5, and I could have alphabetized them, I suppose, but I didn't. It's just 5. Family relationships or relationships of any kind. Religious concepts, money, sex, and or intimacy, sex, intimacy, of however you define it, and personal habits. And so let's just talk for a little bit about each of those categories and why I think we can lump all of our marriage differences within one of those 5 things. You already know why I think it's important to do that, and that is back to this statement here that we need to give every argument in marriage needs an identity. If we give it an identity, then we can stick to that particular topic, that issue. So if we just start arguing about, your parents, my in-laws, if we just start arguing about them, and we don't realize that we have slipped into this arena right here, that I'm attacking family, that I'm attacking blood. Well, we're blood. Yeah, we're not really blood. You're more blood to your parentage than you are to each other. You become one blood when you have a child, I suppose, but it's a vow and a vow only, but you are the blood offspring of that family. And man, when you start attacking your spouse's family for a quick introduction and a quick example, you might as well be attacking your spouse, because it's going to be natural for your spouse to become defensive and to not share your bad attitude toward them. Well, at least they did some good things. They might not have done many, but it's perfectly fine for the spouse to be critical or condemning of their own parentage, but not somebody else. And that's just kind of the way. It's a good rule of thumb for all of us. My wife and I have had opportunities to have many discussions about her parents and mine. And fortunately for us, we've been able to avoid any opinionated things in all these 40 some odd years. I respected her parents. She respected my parents. And even if we might not have completely had the same point of view about them, we left that alone. Only when it might have affected our kids, their grandkids on either side, when we thought something might affect their safety or their well-being or whatever, only then did we actually have to have conversations about it. And it would have been very foolhardy to have simply started a tirade against her family, because she will always have a relationship with them. I will always have a relationship with mine. Our parents are all long since deceased and grandparents now, but we will always have a relationship with wherever we came from, whoever we're connected to. And so marriage doesn't end that. Insecure spouses sometimes want to have this absolute loyalty. We're married, it's us now, it's nobody else, but you're never just us. You're always part of the larger picture of where you came from and what you will be and how your kids will be connected. So I've watched over the years, marriages have so many more conflicts now than they did 50 years ago, only because of the increase in divorce and children coming along in the first marriage or a second marriage. And then we marry a second time or a third time, and there are kids, and then there are grandkids, and those things cost money. Those kids do, and those grandkids do. And those kids are not always perfect. And sometimes those kids get involved in drugs, and sometimes those kids get pregnant before they're married, or they get a girl pregnant out of marriage, and it's so difficult for the non-blood related spouse to start having to shell out money and time and make energy and effort and change plans and adjust calendars and meetings in order to accommodate the crisis or the need or the problems of a spouse's previous set of kids or relationships. And man, you talk about a quick detour to a quick end of a marriage. If we don't know how to stick with just the issue at hand and how it's going to affect us and our kids and that sort of thing, this is a nightmare, just waiting for the wrong word, the wrong match to be lit, and then it's over. we are always a part of the larger picture, not just our marriage. We can't get married and hunker down in a house and it's just us two and no more. It just doesn't happen. We have friends, we have to work with people, we have friends at work, our spouse has friends. Our friendships may not be the same. We may not like the same traits in people that the other likes. We may have an eclectic sort of mix of the people we want to have over to the house and or not. And there may be reasons why one of the spouses can't divulge to the other spouse, that person and I are not compatible. And the more belligerent we become and argumentative we become and more we need to be right and you need to understand me, the less we're going to have true intimacy in a marriage and work things out. Every husband and wife has, I don't know if you could ever put a number on it, but you have so many more relationships outside of that home. In that home, all I got to worry about is my wife or your husband if you're the woman. That's kind of all you got to worry about. How are we going to live? How are we going to talk to each other? How are we going to settle where are we going to eat? How much we're going to spend tonight? What about the kids in school? That's great. But every one of us walks out that door and we go into the world where we have to relate to other people. And so we have friends and we have enemies. And we want to come home and vent about the enemies, but the enemy might not be their enemy. But we want them to hate whoever we hate if we're immature along that line. How do we decide her battle is my battle? Is it really? I've watched people get into this idea that if my wife, in fact, I had a good man tell me years ago, my wife and so in our acquaintance got into they got into a clash, and I'm telling you, they went at each other, and then I had to step in and get involved. And he was my friend, but she's my wife, and I had to take her side. And that's a general idea. I got to take her side because she's my wife. And so he took her side, and when he took her side, a war broke out beyond that marriage, and then some enemies were formed. And then somebody threatened a lawsuit because it affected a business agreement. And by the time I was actually told about it, I was told because help was being sought. I need some advice. I'd like to have an opinion. And so I listened to a long, sordid story that all started because he had this wonderful knight in shining armor mentality. I got to take my wife's point of view. And at one point, I finally just asked, look, just between me and you now, man to man, privately here, nobody's listening to us, just me and you. Do you think your wife was right when she turned on that person like she did and said what she did? Do you think she was actually right? You think she had the right opinion and the right attitude and the right mindset? Or do you think if she'd waited 30 minutes, she might not have even said that because it really wasn't that important? He said, oh, I have no doubt she was wrong, but she's still my wife. And I said, okay, that's what I needed to hear you say because she was wrong. There's no question. She was out of control. She let her temper, her attitude, her hot head take over, and she insulted and destroyed and tore down some people in front of some other people. And so let's just say it the way it really is. I'm going to say it in my language. Your wife went on a tirade and destroyed a handful of people because she was wrong and out of control. And then you jumped into the fight and took her side. That means that you're as dumb as she was. And he said, well, what am I supposed to do? And I said, maybe nothing. Maybe it's one of those things you should have just waited till you got home and let her cool down for a day or two and then kind of bring it up tenderly and try to resolve this without attacking your wife. Just, maybe help her see some other people's point of view. And then when she got mad at you, just table it and calm down and say, okay, and bring it up 3 days later. This is one of those things might have taken 3 or 4 weeks, 3 or 4 months to kind of start healing. But one thing you admitted to me is she was wrong, but she's your wife. You got to stand up for your wife because she's your wife. And I'm just going to tell you that just standing up for somebody who's wrong doesn't make her right. Doesn't make, if the wife stands up, he's my husband, he expects me to stand up for him, and he does something really heinous and stupid, maybe both of you can go to jail together. They won't give you same cells. You'll be in different jails. But there comes a place and time where we have to say, my spouse is not always going to be right about their opinions about friends or relationships or anybody else. But I can't tell my spouse, you're wrong as wrong can be. I better be wiser than that. And just wait and let a few things play out, and then come back and approach it from the standpoint of the verses we read from 1 Corinthians. Love is patient, love is kind, love doesn't seek its own way, love bears all things, love hopes all things. And so the idea that we just have to agree with our spouse is naive and foolish. The idea that we can disagree with them and insult them and still have a great harmony and intimacy is equally naive and foolish. And that's why we started it with what an argument really is supposed to be, and those 2 I rules. Don't stick to the issue always, and never insult your spouse. And so you look at these things on your screen, and man, you got friends at your club, a golf club, a gym, whatever your habits and your hobbies are. You got church friends, and you might not like the same people. And sometimes you got ex-spouses in the picture, and they still have to come around for visitation rights, pick up kids, got to do things at the holidays. It's not always pleasant. Sometimes it's never pleasant. But those relationships can cause so many conflicts in a married couple. And most of the conflicts, I can tell you, most of those conflicts are totally resolvable and totally unnecessary to create any kind of bad reaction between a husband and a wife. If we can just identify that that's what this is a conflict over our relationships. Let's talk about it, and just talk about it with no insults and no punishment and no I gotta win, and then don't resolve anything. Bring it up a week later and talk about it again. And if it still doesn't have a resolution, just don't try. Bring it up again, bring it up again. Religious concepts, same thing. Every couple has, we used to say when I was younger, everybody would say, probably a bad phrase, but they would say, you ought to always marry within your kind. I'm talking about religion now. And what they meant in those days was, you ought to marry within your denomination. A Baptist girl needs to marry a good Baptist boy. A Pentecostal boy better marry a good Pentecostal girl. A Methodist better marry a Methodist, or they're never going to get along. And nowadays, man, I've performed so many weddings over the last 45 years or so, and I have married every kind of denomination to every kind of denomination, including a couple of times that we put Jews with Christians. And I'm not a counselor, don't try to be a counselor. Took a number of courses on counseling, decided that maybe I ought to be. Got involved with it for about 1.5 years or 2. And then I decided, nope, that's not where I belong. I belong in ministry, preaching the Word of God, not trying to help married people stay married and be their best. It was funny, my first marriage, the first wedding I performed was in 1973. I was a new pastor in 1973. Founded a church up in North Texas, and by the end of that year, a young couple came, wanted to get married. It was my first wedding to perform as a pastor. I felt an obligation to meet with the couple, and so I met with the couple, and we walked through about 3 hours of pre-marriage meetings and counseling and talked about issues and how it's going to be. Married them, proud to have my first wedding underfoot, you know, a couple of photographs, put that in my album so I'll always know who my first wedding was. A year later, they came and let me know they're getting a divorce. I thought it was my fault. I thought I didn't spend enough time with that couple to set them up and prepare them for all the problems that were going to come. So I took it personally, but I went back and took that photo out and threw it in the trash and said, I'm not keeping any more records of marriages that I perform. If they're going to all end, there's only one, if they're going to all end in divorce, I'm going to not keep up with them. And so then I decided over the next couple of years that I really needed to develop a marriage counseling program, and I came up with a 6-hour. Couples had to meet with me for 2 hours at a time, 3 times before I would marry them. What a disaster. What a pain. I should apologize publicly to all the couples that I put through those 6 hours, because I can tell you, the ones that were going to get divorced have got divorced anyway, in spite of 6 hours. And the ones that were going to stay together are still together, and it had nothing to do with those 6 hours. It had to do with their own maturity, their own wisdom, their own ability to let the scriptures define them and their character, and go right back to that definition of love we started this with, and let love become their foundation. And so when it comes to religion, and people, you need to marry your kind, I don't know if there is a kind to marry. Because some of the worst marriages and the worst fights I've seen marriages dissolve into have been same kind. Two good people raised by the same kind of denominational parents, and it just couldn't have been a better picture for everybody. Everybody's happy because they're all saved and sanctified, and they're all going to heaven eternally. And then 5 years later, they hate each other, and they pull out guns and knives and whatever. It's funny, I say that, I probably shouldn't even mention this, it's a total rabbit hole. But last week, I was cleaning some stuff out of my garage to throw junk away, and I came across a little package. I had no clue what it was. So I tore into it carefully in case there were spiders in it, and of all things, I did not know that I had a stack of letters about like that. I had a stack of letters that had been sent to me when I was in Vietnam. And my original dog tags. I thought I'd lost them all these years. I didn't even know I still had them. My original dog tags were in there, even with a rubber wrap around them for the Vietnam, because it would turn your neck green. They were cheap. And so they gave us rubber covers in that climate to cover your chain with, and the dog tags. And there that stuff is. And I'm like, well, that's cool. And so when I had time after I finished my chores, I took them inside, and I decided to start opening them and seeing what they were. There's a reason I had apparently put that little stack of letters aside many long years ago. And it's because they were all the ones that I got after I had gotten a Dear John from my fiance. And so there was a letter in there from my fiance's daddy. There was a letter in there from the father of the man that eventually married my fiance. There were letters from my parents. There were letters from my sisters. None of them were pretty. And I read a few of them to my wife. I said, you got to listen to a few of these letters. And I read a couple of them to my wife, and I'm telling you, I'd come to a place I'd be reading, my wife would say, what? Read that again. I'd read it again. Yep, they said that. And at the end of it, I said, I'm kind of glad I came across these, because I've kicked myself over the years. Some of you know that I fought a great battle with depression right toward the end of my tour. I didn't want to come home. I didn't want to come home. I thought I'd just go AWOL at the gate and just let somebody drive me out in the country, and I'd get off somewhere, and I just won't come home. I'll just do whatever. Let nature take its course in that zone. And I couldn't find anybody going out. So I went back to my hooch, fell across my cot, laid there, and that's when I reached a hand up, and my life kind of turned on that moment. And so I told my wife, I said, reading these letters, I'm going to stop kicking myself. I've kicked myself saying, how could I have gotten so low? How could I have gotten so low? Then I read those letters, and I realized how I got so low. I had nothing to come home to. It was pitiful. One of the letters on this note, on reading, I thought about it right now. My mom was just trying to ignore the stuff that was going on back home at one point. So she just started trying to catch me up on family stuff. Now, if any of my family ever sees this, I'm going to have to change names dramatically. So I'm just going to say A, B, C, D instead of names. So my mom is right there. One letter, and here's my mom starting, second paragraph. Well, A and B are still having marriage problems, and in fact, they got so mad at each other over C and D last week that they pulled out guns and just started shooting at each other. And the police had to come, and fortunately nobody went to jail, but they're separated right now, and A is living with C and D, and they're just letting them stay in there. You remember they didn't even like C and D. I don't even know how that happened, because one of the things they always griped about was C and D. And so then a couple of weeks ago, A decided that he had to defend C and D against B, because B had started calling the house and causing more trouble. So A went over to have another confrontation with B. These are relatives of mine, you understand. And this time they got into it with each other with knives, and then one of them lost the knife, and he got a baseball bat, and they were trying to kill each other with baseball bats in the front lawn. Neighbors got the police involved. And that's not the whole story. It just keeps going. She just kept going to update me on some family things back home while I'm in Vietnam, and thinking, you know, there's nothing for me to come home to. And then I'm reading that, and I'm like, yeah, these are my relatives. I don't want to go home. I believe I might stay in Vietnam forever. I just don't see any point to go home. Now, I was reading them the other night, and they're actually comical. And some of those people are already dead that, you know, were trying to kill each other and didn't succeed. And they've already finally died, so they can't ever kill anybody or try to again. But it was just sad to read those letters and realize that not only has my life kind of come dramatically and completely changed, everything I'm reading from these people makes me not ever want to get married, not even be a Christian, not ever go home, maybe change my last name and just disappear. And so when I came home, you've heard me say I stayed home for a few weeks, long enough to get a car and get a few things together, and then I hit the road traveling. I never came back, never lived with my mom and dad again. I literally hit the road traveling. I didn't know I was going to. I just went to preach a revival for a church in East Texas, and the phone rang, and another pastor said, would you come speak at my church? And so I spent 2 years traveling from Mississippi to California, back and forth, Colorado, Arkansas, just preaching wherever a door opened and I could go. I was so glad to just be on the road all the time and not get to watch anybody's marriage disintegrate. And these people that Mom was writing about, A and B, trying to shoot each other, these were wonderful, Christian, compatible people in the same denomination. And at one point, their marriages had been big churches with ministers up there and all the flowers and hymns sung. Probably even a little talking in tongues going on at some of them. I mean, they loved God until they didn't love each other. And man, that's a long, sad story. But if you are married to somebody and you have totally different religious points of view, you, for example, don't think you should take a baseball bat to anybody, and your spouse does. Well, the first thing I'd tell you to do is just run. Just get out the front door and run, and don't go back until the bats are all removed from the house. But the other thing I would tell you is that if you ever do try to have a conversation about religious things, you better stick to the issue and don't insult the person. If you don't, you're done. Every conflict we have, just give it that name. Let's talk about this attitude, this religious point of view. Let's talk about this. I've watched couples grow together. You know, I can tell you horror stories, but I can also tell you some really great stories. I have watched couples grow together towards such a compatible and wonderful faith. I've watched couples get married who had totally different religion theologies about baptism, and after a year or two of being married together, one of them is just ready to be baptized and grew up in a culture that baptism wasn't even important. I have watched couples grow together, and the only way they do is when they follow these simple principles of no power struggle to win and no insults for the person. Just stay with the topic, whether it's how much money do you give to your church, do you have to go all the time, how do you get saved, what do we want our kids to believe about God, or what's our family pressuring us to do, and so on and so forth. And then money is a huge factor in everybody's relationship, but money is just one of those things that has to be. There's no right, well, I mean, there are a lot of rights and wrongs, I guess, but you know, when I was young, I thought everybody had to be on the same page, and you need a joint account, and whichever one of you is the best bookkeeper and likes those numbers, that's the one that ought to be balanced in the checkbook, and nah, that's just all. I wouldn't even waste time with that anymore. Couples need to find their own solution to their own financial plan. How do they do that? By communication. And the only way you can talk about it is, again, not about the person, just about the issue. And you got so many things that you need to talk to your spouses about. Do we have joint accounts? Do we have separate accounts? How much do we put in savings every payday? What are your obligations to our debt? Do you have any obligations to the debt? How do we make the choices that increase our debt? Do we need to talk about it before we make a note on something? Of course you do. And how much personal freedom can we have spending money on our hobbies? And if we're going to invest, we need to invest in something that both of us feel comfortable about. Otherwise, I'm going to invest and it's going to fail and you're going to blame me forever because I wasted all the money on that, which I've done that a few times. I actually dabbled with the stock market for a while and invested in a variety of things for a while, with or without my wife's consent. I mean, I would tell my wife, I bought some of this, I did some of that, I hope it works. My wife, okay, whatever. And then, you know, a few months later, it would be like, I'd be looking at my E-Trade account, or back then my Edwards, AG Edwards. I had an account there, and I'd be looking at my numbers, and I'd be like, and I'd call the broker here in Tomball, and he'd say, well, just hang on. It's not fatal yet. Just hang on. Okay, you sure? Yeah, just hang on. Don't do anything. Just hang on. And 3 weeks later, it's zeroed out. And so then I'm like, when do I tell my wife that I lost all of that money in those few investments? I love telling her, hey, we're up $1,200 in our $200 investment. I hated telling her, we lost $5,000. And so eventually I realized I got to quit doing this. This needs to be something we talk about. This can't just be me thinking, oh, shit. Because, you know, her attitude was, y'all know the way people, husband and wife, you know, there's always one wants to talk about the minutia until we're all sick of it. And the other one, I don't care. Just do whatever you want to do. And so that was, you know, she didn't care. I don't care about the details. Yeah, but I need to tell you what so-and-so said. I get phone calls now and then from people say, are you looking for anything to invest in? Nope. I got nothing to invest, not looking. And here a while back, a good friend said, you need to pull this up and check it out. So I did. I jumped online, pulled up the prefix he told me about. And it looked promising, it looked good. And I came close to just punching a couple of buttons and moving a few dollars over and buying some. And I'm like, oh, no, don't. And so I didn't. And then that way I didn't even have to have a conversation with my wife about it. Thankfully, because a couple of weeks ago I found out that all bottomed out too. That went away and lost everything. So if I'd put anything in it, it would have all been gone. It's just a disaster for me or anybody watching and listening. It's a disaster to try to handle money matters in a marriage without the communication, the consent, the understanding, the compatibility of each other. And I know I've heard men and women say, but you don't understand, they don't care and they don't understand anything. I know it just needs to be agreed upon that they don't understand and they don't care. There needs to be an agreement. Because if she says, I don't care what you do as long as you don't do over this amount of money, okay. And then I lose that, she can't come back and say, what is wrong with you? You're so stupid. I can say, no, you gave me permission. And so communication is such a wonderful thing. But in marriage, it's not just wonderful. It's the lifeblood of the relationship. Without it, the marriage simply will not work. And then the intimacy or sexual behavior. I used to do seminars years ago and marriage seminars around the country. And sometimes we always had a different format. Sometimes did one out at the airport, Intercontinental. And it was a Friday evening. Everybody got off work. They had to get a hotel room right there at the entrance. I forgot which hotel it was. I drive by it now and then, but can't remember the name of it. But everybody got a room. So they come in, they do a 2-hour session on Friday evening, and then they can go eat, go to the room, do whatever they want to do. And then Saturday morning before checkout, they come down at 9 o'clock for breakfast, and we have another 2-hour session. And so one of the last things on Friday night before they're going to their hotel rooms, and and saying to each other, we're off on a weekend away from the kids and we're in a hotel and let's be sweet to each other. So one of our last topics was intimacy. And I would put out a little questionnaire ahead of time, a little piece of paper, and I had them marked in the corner so I would know male or female. And I told them, do this, and they'd take it and they'd check off a few things, and then I'd collect them and sort them male and female, and so that I could tell the men's reaction. Didn't want names on them by any means. And it was funny because one of the questions I asked was, how do you define intimacy? And and that particular seminar at Intercontinental was the crowning glory. It was the one that was just perfect for me to be able to refer to, because I think there were 20 couples there, so that would be 20 men, 20 ladies, 40 pieces. And memory is bad, but I'm going to say that out of 20 men, 19 men said sex, the definition of intimacy. And out of 20 ladies, not one woman said sex. Every woman wrote. Write your definition of intimacy was the question. Men, sex. Next, women. Intimacy is an emotional attachment, a bond that a couple creates from mutual respect and understanding of each other, words ad nauseum. But it was clever because it actually illustrated a point that I wanted to make. And that is that the reason we struggle sometimes with the intimate level in marriage is because we define it so differently. Men, it's always physical. Oh, I know it's emotional and all that, but it's just pretty much physical. And men can't sometimes understand, why is it so hard for them to understand? I don't know what the problem is. Your body belongs to me, the Bible said. Give it to me. And the woman just wants to be loved and respected and her feelings thought of and treated right, and not treated rudely in the mall while we're out shopping or eating and barked at. Get over here, woman, or whatever. Or a waiter being treated rude in a restaurant and embarrass her with other tables. Good Lord, what do I have to do? Nobody's impressed with rude people. And then you get through being rude somewhere to others, not to her. You're having a dinner. This is a $100 dinner. It sure better pay off tonight. Rude to the waiter. Nothing's going to change. And so then, a man like, well, I don't understand what's wrong. Well, that's right. You don't understand what's wrong. Because a woman's respect and admiration of a man is an accumulation of many things. The way he deals with many things grows her respect and admiration for that man. She needs to see you in some crises and how you handle them. Needs to see you in some awkward moments and see how you handle them. Needs to see a fire that you know how to put out without hurting anybody's feelings or slamming anybody. And as those things accumulate, a woman can develop an intense and passionate respect and loyalty and love for her husband. And it will, in time and in turn, occasionally, pay off in the way that he wants it to pay off. But everybody has to compromise and change their definition of intimacy if the marriage is going to work. And it will not happen when you have conversations about the intimate quality of your relationship and you forget the 2-I rules. You don't stick to that issue by itself and you insult your spouse because they're just not listening, they're not hearing you, they don't understand you, they don't whatever. And sex in particular becomes one of the most self-centered things that we argue about because we're always trying to see it only from our point of view, not from the other person's point of view. So there are several things on that page there about sex that we argue about, and then we'll move quickly to personal habits. This could take forever, but we won't let it. hygiene, cleanliness, household chores, needs, work ethic, laziness, temper, anger, hatred, criticism, television, movies, internet, recreation, faith, commitments. I don't know how I left off belching and passing gas. Those should have been on there too, because you know how your wife is about that. She just won't stop, no matter how many times you say, that's vulgar, don't do that. She just won't quit. Nobody believes that. I don't get it. One of the great surprises we all have when we get married is how many habits the other person has I didn't know they had. And how many we have that we hid from them, men especially. Now you guys watching, I know y'all probably never lied to your wife, but I was pretty much a total lie. I was not the man my wife, I didn't like the man I was. So naturally I had to present to her somebody that I thought was being suave and debonair and cool and sending flowers to her office every day for a week, which I've never done ever since in 45 years. I did it one time to hook her, it worked. There's no need to send flowers to her office again 5 days a week. There's just no reason for that, which is what she found out. I did not marry the kind of man that's going to send me flowers very often at work. He did once, and that was it, because he is really not that kind of person. He's pretty cheap, gets right down to it, which she's right. I am pretty cheap. But the truth is, the sad truth is, many of us don't really want the person we're going to marry to see us like we are, like we fear we have become. So we do. We put our best foot forward and we act a little better than we would normally act, including how we treat others, because we know that's important to her. I'm going to be nice to these people here. I'm going to be respectful in the restaurant. And then you get married and you got them. So then you can just let your hair down and be what you tried to hide for a while. It's not a huge problem, I'm sure, but I mean, it just comes down. You see some of those things on the screen, and I don't know how long it took y'all to decide who was going to hold the remote control for the TV. It took me about 30 years. I finally gave up on it. I don't care. My wife can watch anything she wants to watch. I'll just sit there and watch it. If she hears me snoring, I'll just drag a shoe on the floor like, oh, my shoe made a funny noise, didn't it? This is really good. I'm enjoying this. What is this channel? Hallmark? Oh, I love Hallmark. It's my favorite. It's so romantic. I just wish the woman would get the guy now and then. Oh, she does get that? Oh, I'm glad the woman gets the guy, the right guy, and not the other guy that came to town to break up the wedding. You know. Everybody is different, and we're supposed to be. We're not supposed to be alike. And I don't know that personal habits ever needs to be dealt with unless your spouse has a habit that really drives you nuts, or that endangers you, or that jeopardizes your kids' safety, or anything else of that nature. Well, then you need to have this conversation. For the most part, most of us probably just need to learn to chill and let our spouses be what they are as far as their habits go, unless it's, of course, offensive or vulgar or dangerous or harmful. And it doesn't matter if you have that, just remember, you got to follow the I rules. So I would wrap this up by saying most marriage conflicts will take the first giant step toward being resolved if we, first of all, identify the conflict. It's not that person. Don't ever say, you're just stupid, you're mean, you're just wrong. That's an insult about the person, and that is not the problem. The problem is not the person you loved and married. The problem is an issue. It's just a problem, a conflict. Give it a name. By giving it a name, you can then discuss your differences about that topic. So if you put it in one of these 5 categories, then you can identify it as this is a relationship thing we need to deal with. This is a religious thing we need to deal with. This is a money thing. This is an intimate thing we need to deal with. This is a habit we need to deal with. And if you bring that up because you really want to make the relationship better, number 3, be sure you always follow the I rules. You stick to the issue and never insult the person that you're talking about. And you don't argue to win, you argue to table an argument for a later date. You don't have to, a power struggle is never a victory. It's always a loss. And so you bring up both sides of an argument following the I rules, and then you table it and say, let's talk about it next week. And while you're waiting for that next meeting, you really consider what the other person said and really learn to hear for the first time maybe what the wife thinks, what the husband thinks, and try to see the conflict from their point of view. And if you do that, you'll find a suitable compromise in time to every issue. You'll be flexible to change your opinion when you start really appreciating and understanding your spouse's point of view. And then if none of that really does change and work, then you at least need to know it's time for us to seek counsel. One of the wisest things some couples do is just submit themselves to a marriage counselor when they're not able to resolve their own conflicts. It took me years of pastoring to finally start recommending people to go to a counselor. And probably 10 to 15 years after I started pastoring, I would say sometime in the early 80s, probably 81, 82, I finally realized couples need outside help. And everything's not biblical. They can't just come to the pastor and say, we're having trouble, because the pastor is not wise enough to get them past that. And so I looked up a counselor, and I got my wife to go with me to visit that counselor. We went to the counselor as if we were a married couple having problems, which we always did in those days, some kind of problem. But I wanted to go to this counselor in our area, and he was a great guy. And so after we went to him, I told him who I was and that I was a pastor. And so he became our go-to counselor. We recommended so many people to go to him. He was able to help a number of families find peace and harmony when they just weren't able to do it on their own. So it's imperative to know that if you do these things and then you cannot find the suitable compromise and you're just not able to be flexible in this area, or she's not or he's not, then there has to come a point in place where you go to a counselor. That's why even in the foyer here, for a long, long time, if you ever look at the little Grace to Go booklets out there, the little free handouts to take, one of them is, do you need a counselor? Inside that one, I've got about 5 counselors' names here in the area that we recommend for counseling for couples that need it. And one of the best things I ever did in the early 80s. And then when that man passed away, we found another counselor, had him come to speak at the church a few times over the years. And so the reason for that is we can't always resolve our conflicts. Sometimes we really do need somebody to just help us sit down, stay with the issue, leave the insults off, and then find a way to find a reachable compromise between the two of us. Let's just pause and say a prayer before we quit for all of our relationships. Father, thank you for your blessings on marriage. We believe it's a sacred institution. We believe it reflects the relationship between you and your church. We believe that a husband is supposed to treat his wife as Christ treated the church, loving her and giving himself for her. And we believe the wife is supposed to love the husband and honor him, even as the scripture said, as Sarah honored Abraham, calling him Lord. We believe in that kind of compatibility in marriage. We just don't always reach it because of our flesh and our temperament and our moods. But help us today. Help every marriage be Christ-centered, love-centered, and faith-centered. We pray for help and guidance from you and your word in Christ's name, and everybody say amen. Amen. God bless.